Let's talk inflation first, which I think is the backdrop for the entire investment world right now.
Yep.
The Fed seems to be in control. They say they're going to destroy demand. Inflation numbers today, 9.1%. What is your read as to how to think about the actual inflation people are experiencing? Do you believe the 9.1% number, or do you think there's a different way to think about it?
I think, inflation is a vector. It's not just one static number to say this is the inflation rate. And I think it's pretty well documented that inflation in the areas that matter most, whether you're talking about prices at the pump, food prices, the things that are affecting real everyday people, are dramatically higher than the 9.1%. But even if you go with the broken metrics of 9.1%, we're talking about the highest inflation in 40 years. This is dramatic. And if you look at inflation in other countries, it's considerably worse. So globally, we've got a massive problem and nobody is immune to it. Obviously, it hits people living paycheck to paycheck the hardest because they don't own assets that inflate. With this inflation, it's a really vicious thing. Everybody's in the same boat.
Many investors, including myself, kept talking about Bitcoin as an inflation hedge. I think now there is kind of a nuanced view of that, which is, well, maybe it's not an inflation hedge in the sense of inflation goes up and Bitcoin goes up to combat that, but maybe it's actually a hedge on the loose monetary policy. So if the Fed says they're going to tighten, Bitcoin has come down because people anticipate risk assets to come down. How do you think about whether it's an inflation hedge or it's a loose monetary policy?
I've read some stuff on that as well, and the correlation to the monetary policy is pretty strong. And so right now, that's looking like a pretty viable perspective. That said, I think that Bitcoin ultimately is an inflation hedge, and that what we're dealing with are some unique circumstances where obviously there's very thin float in Bitcoin from a trading volume point of view relative to other assets. So it's not manipulated in a negative way, but when you get things like we have now where there's a correlation to equities with Bitcoin, which I think will ultimately break because Bitcoin is not an equity. But right now it is heavily correlated, and that correlation is being enforced by big macro hedge funds who are using Bitcoin to hedge their equity exposure, particularly to NASDAQ and big tech equity. So if a big macro hedge fund has $1 billion of big tech exposure and they want to hedge that, because the correlation, with Bitcoin to tech is kind of 4-to-1, like almost a 4 beta. So if you had $1 billion of exposure, you could short $250 million of Bitcoin and be equally hedged. So if stocks go down 1%, Bitcoin, is going to go down 4% and vice versa. So I think that's reinforcing this correlation, which is kind of hurting us right now. That'll ultimately break. And I also think we get that kind of technology adoption volatility. Think back to Amazon. Ever since Amazon was a public company, it has lost 80% of its market cap 6 times, and one time more than 90%. So this is kind of expected, and it's hard to be an inflation hedge when you have that degree of volatility. But ultimately, as the asset matures, I think it's going to prove to be an inflation hedge.
When you think of the Fed and their kind of talk track right now, obviously they are talking about destroying demand, which I always remind folks just means they're going to punish you until you stop buying things.
Yeah.
And we have seen risk assets go down because people are selling them because they're listening to the Fed. But inflation's still at 9.1%, and it's actually accelerating. What are they going to have to do? Like, can the Fed actually get inflation under control, or no matter what they do, it's not going to come down? And so maybe they're going to have to pivot before inflation actually comes down.
I don't think they're going to have to pivot before inflation comes down. I think that the Fed can be pretty effective by raising rates. It has a pretty dramatic effect. Maybe the most obvious place to see it is in housing. We're already seeing more housing deals break that are in contract than we've seen in a really long time. And just to follow that through one step, it's as interest rates go up and those mortgage rates that were 2.5%, 3.5% are now 6% mortgage rate, people are breaking those deals. Prices of houses are being revised downward. So I think we're starting to see that, and we're going to see it across the board even more. Demand's going to decrease, and I think there's signs that it already is.
Yeah. When you look at core inflation versus kind of CPI inflation that includes energy and food, is there a reason to look at core inflation? Like, I know the Fed likes to point at it because it's going down right now, so that's their signal of saying, oh, look, inflation is going to get under control. How do you look at those two numbers, and do you put more weight on either one of them?
No, I try to think of it across the entire spectrum of assets and services. And there's what numbers say on reports, docs, news reports, et cetera, and there's what every individual feels. And the truth of the matter is, I think most people only care what their personal exposure to inflation is. How is this affecting me? And everyone goes to restaurants, everyone drives a car. Not everyone's sensitive to those prices. There are people with a ton of money who are like, I don't give a shit if the entree is $50 or $75 at the restaurant I eat. But there are a lot of people who do care about all those things. But those people, even the really affluent people, they do care about whether or not their purchasing power is impacting their ability to purchase a house, And all of a sudden, even that wealthy person who's thinking of buying, this $15 million house and is going to put, $13 million of that in debt on mortgage, they care that interest rate is 6% and not 3%. And so it impacts everyone. I just look at it through my personal vantage point to try to assess what the real impact is. And it's dramatic. I mean, I feel it.